Good morning and welcome back. Thank you for joining us again today. My name is Joan Rubin. I'm the Executive Director of the System Design and Management program here at MIT, one of the co-sponsors of this program. The System Design and Management program is a program that's designed for mid-career professionals. We're designed to take technical leaders and help technical leaders gain management skills. So it's a joint program between the Sloan School of Management and the School of Engineering here at MIT. Our goal in developing this program was to be able to give leaders real practical approaches that would help them go back and think about complex systems and managing complex systems and complex programs and projects. We are about 20 years old right now, and we're now starting to see the people that had come through the program really having an impact on the world around them. One of the things that we've been working in the past couple of years, and I think you see it through this conference here, is to try and broaden the reach and the connection between education and research here at MIT and what's happening in the practical world of business. And so we've broadened our reach with increasing corporate content within the core curriculum itself. We've increased connections for internships, for research, but we've also made a stretch and reach towards faculty across MIT to try and help draw them in, both from a research perspective, engaging our students that bring in that broad understanding of business, as well as being able to connect the research work that's going on here at the university back into corporations. And so we're thrilled to host a conference like this where we bring in that bridge between management and technology and innovation and try and look at that idea of bridging the gap between strategy and implementation, which is what our students in our program tries to do on a daily basis. We're thrilled to have you in for the program today, and I believe I'm looking for Brian. Brian's actually going to give a little bit of the overview of what we have happening today, and then we'll bring on our first speaker of the morning. Thank you.
Thanks, Joan, and good morning, everyone. Hope you had a good rest. I know we have many time zones represented, so, but always the second day is the hardest, right? So we'll try to keep you awake. Today, we have an interesting day that finishes relatively early. This morning, we will continue with the presentations and papers. And on behalf of the organizing group and the researchers here at MIT, we want to continue to encourage you that no matter which camp you may come from, we have academics who study strategy, we have professionals who act on strategy, including consultants, we have engineers and implementers and academics who study engineering and implementation. So it's very easy for us, especially when hearing for the first time someone in one of these other camps, to dismiss what they don't know about what we've studied. It's very simple. And so instead, I hope that we continue to dig a little deeper. There's a reason that these other camps have evolved and done their work the way they have. And yes, it may be true that an academic like me, if I'm studying engineering, may miss the subtleties. But however, the things that we do may provide different insights. So we're looking for that capacity for this group at the bridge, the intersection of strategy and implementation, to continue to uncover phenomena and to think today especially about what should we be doing in a genuine research agenda in coming years to really find what Vic will share with us today are the underlying principles, physics, characteristics of complex socio-technical systems in the bridge from strategy to implementation. This afternoon, we can see the workshops. Part of that agenda, part of our research premise is that not only the typical things we do in ethnography and survey work, in modeling of these organizations and products as systems, but we want to begin to be significantly more empirical. We need to not only claim ideologically what frameworks might be useful, but how can we begin to sense these phenomenon that we've been talking about. So there are three very early experiments that we call instrumented teamwork. And in the instrumented teamwork, we not only provide a forum through which different actors, and in the case of this symposium, cross-functionally, those who focus on strategy and those who focus on implementation, can we observe how they pay attention? Can we observe their mental models as they enter into the workshops and evolve during the workshop? Can we see how they interact? Can we see how the social space changes? Can we see the way that they touch and interact with the problem space? Can we see the things they're considering in the solution space? Can we see their path dependence as they begin to explore a trade space of decisions and options? So these three hands-on experiences today are meant to help you, with us, think about what would a class of new experiments be to help us, in addition to our traditional methods of research, begin to uncover the phenomenon of socio-technical systems in this regime. So I hope these three, each of them could seat probably 20 to 30 people easily. So we do not have any way for reservations. So you first come, first serve, but please think about which of these three you may be interested in participating in, and I think you'll really enjoy them. So with that encouragement for us to continue our cross-camp dialogue today, let me ask Martin, one of our students, to introduce our keynote speaker.
Thank you, Brian. So it's my pleasure to introduce John Dyson. John has spent 25 years at GlaxoSmithKline, where he worked on multiple projects in many countries. At GSK, he set up the front-end factory, which was described as industry best practice by McKinsey. He led the development and testing of the first pharmaceutical componentized solution, the factory in a box, featured in the UK government Farmer Report on Construction as leading a revolution. John left GSK as VP and head of capital strategy and design. He now works independently on key infrastructure projects, as well as at advancing approaches to project management and construction. John holds a degree in biochemistry and nutrition from the University of Newcastle, England, and is a visiting professor at the University of Birmingham in industrial project management. He has also a strong interest in psychotherapy, especially in the interplay between personal actualization and purposeful collaboration. Please join me in welcoming John Dyson.
Hello, good morning, and thank you very much for inviting me to talk today. I was really fascinated yesterday about some of the discussions, and it's really got me thinking about some areas. And I'm also very interested in, even though I work with a university, how much in business we don't look outside to academia and theory and bring those ideas back. So I'm very enthused by the symposium so far. I'm really looking forward to the rest of today. I'll just say that the last time I was talking about this subject, I was at the Institute of Civil Engineers in central London. And I remember standing there, and right in front of me was a bust of Isambard Kingdom Brunel. And I felt very sort of under the vision of such a fantastic engineer of the past. And I suppose I feel a bit like that today, because I've got lots of very clever academics who are watching what I'm saying and doing. But I wanted to talk today really to tell you the story of Front End Factory, what it was, how it came about, and a little bit about Factory in a Box as well. But this is really about the journey that I went on with GlaxoSmithKline, about how you turn company strategy into capital projects. These are capital projects, but also how we learned through that there are ways and means of doing the same thing with non-capital investment projects. And what we learned through the process is that things like creativity are really important in this stage, and that's not what most people think about construction, is creativity. People talk a lot about collaboration. I'm gonna go into that because collaboration is very important, but there's a sense of taking collaboration seriously. It's a serious matter. It's not just something we talk about and pretend happens naturally. You've got to take collaboration seriously. And then finally, I think one of the things I learned is the difficulty of challenge. People talked yesterday about how businesses get something into their mind. People are very strong about their ideas. And part of the role of this is to be challenging people, is to speak out when you see things are not right and to create challenge. And when I was asked to put this presentation together, one of the things that really keeps coming back to me, and it's here, engineers love to draw straight lines. And someone talked yesterday about a bendy line for projects, and that for me is absolutely clear. Moving from strategy to projects is not a straight line process. And just putting in a sort of cursory feedback loop doesn't really make it. These are iterative processes, and that requires a collaboration to iterate. Get my... So I'd been in the job head of global capital projects for about 3 or 4 years, and there was a huge amount of pressure that capital projects weren't going well in the business. Not necessarily because we weren't delivering to time or cost. Actually, we were doing pretty well on that piece, but capital projects really weren't delivering the strategy for the company, weren't delivering the benefits that the company needed. It was the time that now the current CEO of GlaxoSmithKline, Emma Walmsley, came in, and she had a really strong view that we needed to invest in the consumer healthcare business. So their capital plan was gonna really rise, and they had some really important strategies about growing that business. But on the background of, well, really, have we got the right things in place to deliver? And so what I decided to do was to go to some people that I'd spoken to in the past, who had very different ideas about projects and the way they worked, and start to have a conversation about how the whole issue of turning strategy into projects and designing projects might change. And that was the birth of Front End Factory, and it was literally like a few people in a room sitting around a table, scratching our chins and discussing how it could be different and better. It was no more than that to start with. It was just an idea. And then what happened was a project that was actually going on, but we got interested in it. And this project was about Lucozade and Ribena, their soda, soft drinks, and they were really looking to grow the market in Africa. That was the strategy. And what had happened, this is a bit sort of looking back on the project of what had happened, is a series of miscommunications and a straight line process. So the CEO, the owner of that business, had said, you know, the strategy in Africa, the strategy around this is to build a presence in the market. Having a factory in the market is really important to that presence, and that will help grow the business. And what everyone heard is, build something. You need to build something. And then the finance director takes over the story. And what they're really interested in is understanding margin. In order to deliver the margins they need the cost of goods down. So they conclude that what they need to do is build something and build something cheap, whatever that means, low cost, so we can protect the margins. When I talk about an architect, I'm really talking about the person who then tries to turn those ideas into the physical manifestation of it. And what they heard was there's a high aspiration here. There's a big aspiration. So when you talk about building something, they want something big. And then, well, how do you build something big and cheaply in Africa? Well, use concrete, because that's what people use in Africa. So you start making decisions based upon your translation of the original strategic intent. And then the engineer starts going, oh, well, these are products, eventually we weren't going to sell a lot of them. There's lots of water to sell, certainly, as well as other products. So we need to put in high-speed machinery. You know, it needs to be well serviced. So they put in high equipment specs. So all these people are making decisions based upon their understanding of what's been said to them. And what had happened is that process had taken about 9 months, which is in itself a long time. And also they'd spent about $1 million on engineering fees with big engineering companies to understand what that looks like. And what they came out with is a proposal for a $100 million factory, and the business case had a negative NPV. It didn't make any sense. So this was the opportunity. This was the opportunity for us to have a look, front-end factory. What we'd already figured out is that we couldn't take a brief from the business. That doesn't work. Building a factory is not something that you should start with. What you should start with is an understanding of the problem or opportunity the business is trying to grasp. And as well as developing that, we also need to understand what value they're really trying to derive from that opportunity. And then what we also had already worked out is this needs to be iterative. So we're not going to just answer it first off. We're going to answer it, have a go back to the business, share with them, and create a conversation. So this is a simplification of the problem statement we came up with, but really the business, what the business was looking at was to grow a profitable business in these markets. And interestingly, when you start asking the questions and having the conversations, one of the key issues was actually complaints. That was one of the drivers for a new factory, because it was nearer the customers and they were having logistics problems. So they felt that it could overcome that. Meeting the demand is obviously another value. They need to meet whatever the growth of demand is. And then the growing sales and the margin, the financial aspect's obviously key. It's a simplification, but we tried to boil it down to what the opportunity was. And then we started to do two things. The first thing is a very engineering-y type thing we did, which was we broke the process down into chunks, sort of value-added process units. At this point, we didn't know what to call them, but we broke them down. And then we tracked how each product mix went through those units. And we realized that if you then put a financial model against those units, including labor cost, energy cost, and the equipment and depreciation, you could then have a really dynamic model of what different product mixes and different capacities and would drive in terms of cost. And when we started to put those blocks down as well, we realized that actually in the early years, you don't need anywhere near as big a factory. And if we made it of simple steel structure, we didn't need to build a big factory because we could extend it in the future. So we had this idea that actually thinking about the construction differently could save money. And what that immediately did, which was good, was take 25% off the capital cost. Sounds good. But the NPV was still slightly negative, wasn't good enough still. But what we found more, which was really what woke us up in the front-end factory, was when we did that cost analysis, when we looked at different products moving through these parts of the process, is that their biggest product in the first 5 years, which was bottling water, would actually make them a loss. And that was the main thing that was driving the negative NPV, not the capital, but the fact that people had misunderstood how water is made. And the reason for that, it turned out, was that in where they were going to build the factory, the energy costs were going to be much higher because they would have to generate all their energy by diesel, whereas their current site, they had a gas supply. So the energy cost is about 4 times greater. Water costs quite a lot of energy to make, but water has very low margin in the marketplace. So what we proved to them is actually there was a fundamental flaw in the idea. And so they didn't build a factory at all. So that's great because they saved 100% of their capital. But also, we said, well, why don't you have another way of looking at your issues around logistics? And all it was about some of their logistics suppliers and the packing of the product and so on. So we worked with them to improve their logistics. So they sorted out their issues that they had without spending any capital, and worked out how they could extend their current factory and meet the demand. And maybe in the future, maybe in 10, 15 years when that market's really established, maybe then there's a business case for delivering. So what we've come up with is something that we later called, and this is Bryden Wood, who I worked with on this thing that we call chip thinking. And interestingly, Bryden Wood have just won the Queen's Award for Innovation in the UK, really high honour for chip thinking. And this is the idea of understanding your value chain. I mean, in a manufacturing context, your value chain is what touches the product. So in a factory, it's warehouse and then different processing units and so on. And then in the supply chain, logistics. But what we also found is that you can use this for non-physical assets. It's about breaking down your value chain into things which you can then model independently and model as the whole. So it allows you to play dynamic scenarios. But it also, we found, created this really common language. It was something everyone could talk about because a chip meant different things to different people. Engineers like chips because they start to tell them they can put their equipment inside them. They have a physicality. They can work out what utilities they need. Construction can think about building them. But interestingly, human resources can think about what people are required in that chip and what level of training they require, what capability they require to run that particular chip. And commercial people and finance people are interested in the margin that chip does. How much cost does it add and how much value does it add to their product? So it allows you to have a common conversation about the project and play with it. So I'm just going to show you a video now of it's sort of semi-real. It's a bit of a fantasy, but this is sort of the process and things we've been working on to allow you to use chips and iterate really quickly. So that should autoplay. Oh, there you go. So over time, what we've done is develop, I mean, these are engineers' version of a chip, which is the sort of three-dimensional representation of part of the process. But they also come with their capacity models and their costing models within them as well. And they're also intelligent. So as you put chips together, they understand things like connecting corridors. The capacity model tells you how big the warehouse needs to be. And because they understand how much utilities they are, the model can also then pick up what utility supply you need. So you can play a game, in this instance, looking at a factory. You can play a game with what that factory might look like in chip terms. We then used some clever AI design, which allowed us to design the utilities well enough for us to cost and understand the implications of that. And also, I'll talk about factory in a box, but if you've got a standard building way of building as well, you can put a building around that. And you can understand how much that costs, not only to invest in, but over time, what the operational cost will be, what the margin of products going through that facility will be. You can model that. And then you can iterate. On some projects, we had 35 options because you can do this incredibly quickly, so you can understand the benefits. The other huge thing, of course, you're working in a digital environment and you've got very clever people, is all the chips have predefined what they look like. as you put them together into a factory, you can actually take people into that factory very early on. While you're still talking about strategy, you can talk about what the factory looks like. And this is real. We can do this really quickly. In a matter of hours from designing a factory, we can take people for a walk in it. And that's really important when you're developing new products and new processes because there's a lot of uncertainty. So you can start having real conversations about what it might be like and thing. But it's all digital. None of it's real. You spend very little money, and you can just play in this space. So that's a little bit about the sort of logistics of how you front-end factory. But what we also found really important was the collaboration, the creative collaboration. And that starts off with really dispelling the notion of a leader in the environment. The leader becomes the business requirement, which you turn into a problem statement. What you want is everybody working in that collaboration to be only interested in the business requirement and generating value. And the job of the leader, or my job, was twofold. One of them was to facilitate them doing that and to encourage them, encourage people to be open-minded, encourage people to really throw themselves into the problem and try and solve it. And the other role for me was to protect them, because that's not normal, and people aren't normally allowed just to free think. And so my role was to keep the politics at bay, to keep people happy behind me, to let the people there just work and be creative and collaborative. What we also found was that where you collaborate is really important. And this was completely unplanned, but we ended up collaborating within an office in central London rather than within GSK itself. And what we found is that people act very differently when you put them in their corporate environment to when you take them out. In their corporate environment, people take on roles. They sort of have a feeling and a constraint about how they need to be because of their role within the business. When we took them out and put them in an arena which wasn't normal and was a nice place to be in the centre of London, those barriers broke down. People started just to share what they knew and thought and didn't feel constrained by their role within the business. And that was a great learning for us and something we hadn't really anticipated. We also realised that we had to come up with some common principles of how we work together, and these are some of them. So a common language, the chips, became a really common language, and people started to talk about them. And the other piece which came out yesterday as well was transparency. So transparency is really important. Transparency, we imagined that the front-end factory process was in a goldfish bowl, and that anybody who walked up to it could see inside what was happening. That was our goal, and we never got there, but that was our goal. And one of the particular things we did on transparency, and it's been mentioned already in this symposium, is when you're developing strategy and ideas, you've got to guess things often, or perceive of virtual things. There's lots of things that aren't tangible. And we wanted people to guess, but you need to know they're a guess. And what gets mixed up sometimes is you ask someone a question and they guess, but they don't tell you it's a guess. So we came up with a system where we wanted people to guess, and we basically stamped their piece of data or information as a guess, or a more certain piece of information, or a very clear information. And then what we did is, with those guesses, is you do sensitivity analysis. So what happens if that's completely wrong? What happens if it's a bit wrong? How sensitive is that guess? Some guesses don't matter, but some of them are incredibly important. So those then would become what we call a sub-problem, was how do we put some definition around that guess? But the whole idea is to be really transparent about the quality and level of information and where it's coming from. With that also comes the whole idea of visualizing data. So people come with data often on spreadsheets, and I don't know about you guys, but you sit at a spreadsheet and it just means nothing to you. So we always took people's information and presented it in a way on a graph, often also trying to put the detailed information with the overall high-level information behind it to constantly contextualize what information was being shared. And we found that was a really, really important thing to do, to get people to understand the sort of space of the problem and space of the solution and be able to work together in a consistent way. So that visualizing of information, really important. And then finally, we wanted to capture information. So much is lost when you do this sort of work. And the whole idea of the front-end factory was that we were going to do multiple ones of these. So we wanted a way of having a warehouse in our factory. And at one point we drew it, where we would put chips and other things, models and so on, in that warehouse so that we would continue to capture knowledge. The next thing, which I say was part of my role, was to get people to think wildly. I supported divergent thinking, and that, once again, is difficult in a business context often. So when an idea comes up, people go, no, that'll never work. Or we've tried that before, or no, that's stupid. There is very much that sense, and I wanted to break away from that, because even the most divergent thought at the beginning actually can lead on to ideas which are incredibly valuable to the business. We took on a project which was to build a new factory in Japan based upon the fact that the current factory wouldn't live up to the current seismic regulations in a few years' time. And someone in the group just said, well, surely we could just, strengthen the building with steel, And everyone said, no, it's already been looked at, will never work. 3 months later, we went back and said, no, we've done some dynamic modelling. We brought some experts in from New Zealand, etc. We did some clever dynamic modelling, and we showed we could save the business £100 million by just strengthening the current building. And it just takes that one person to ask that question and allow them to be listened to, important. Political agnostic is the hardest part. We got a project in, a very senior guy brought it in, about £130 million project. And he said, the only one thing, because I know you're free thinking, you guys, so the only one thing that's absolutely sure, and that is you're going to put it inside this existing building. Because this existing building's been there for a number of years, we haven't really used it, it's sitting there on our books. So you just, whatever you do, it goes inside that building. I had the unfortunate job about 3 months later of telling him that we wanted to knock that building down. And I said it to his boss as well, and I said, look, this is why, and we showed them the modelling that we'd done to show how much better it would be if we built a brand new building and didn't try and skip it in, and the benefits, both fairly short term but long term, in delivering cash back to the business were huge. But that's quite difficult to do because these are very senior people and they're telling you what to do. So that sort of agnosticism is difficult. And then finally, I was going to say, taking collaboration seriously. This is a model that came out of a piece of work from the Royal Academy of Engineers in the UK, which I had the fortune to be part of developing. It's sort of a model, but basically what it does is democratizes collaboration on a project. So it allows everyone to vote against all those criteria on the outside where they are. And then through a series of facilitated discussions, both at group level, so individuals are grouped maybe by their company or discipline or however you want to do it, you facilitate them to have a really honest discussion about why it's not working, and then you take all those back to the high level of the project and once again have a facilitated discussion and agree what 3 actions you're going to take. And then 2 weeks later or a month later, you run that voting system again. And you can track how well your collaboration is working. And it's a relatively sophisticated interlinked model as well. So taking collaboration really seriously is important. we'd sort of proved that this idea of front-end factory on a number of projects was really working well. I think by the time that this strategic intent came to us, we'd probably done about 14 or 15 opportunities that we turned into decisions to do things or not. Interestingly, one of my key principles was don't build. So we were looking at every opportunity not to build. Buildings are very inadaptable things for businesses. As soon as you commit to it, you've curtailed your adaptability quite significantly. So therefore, if you don't build, the freedom is still there to modify and change. So our first thing was don't build, and our second thing was build small, adaptable, was our piece. Our CEO at the time, Andrew Whitty, came out and said that he wanted to grow the business. This was the pharmaceutical business in Africa. And he didn't want to do that just by going in and selling our products into Africa. He wanted to do it by investing in the people. And that meant investing on the ground in both physicality, but also in the people themselves. So our presence there would help grow capability and benefit for all. And at the time, he wanted to build 5 facilities quite quickly across the continent. And so that came in as a problem to us. How do we do that? How do we take advantage of that? And out of that came this idea of factory in a box. And it was a very simple principle that we came up with. One of them was that a container, classic sea freight container, you can get anywhere in the world. Anywhere you go in the world, you'll see a container. So if we can put anything we need inside a container, we know we can get it to any part of Africa. So that's really good. So that was the box bit. And then the second thing is how do we do that so we can engage with the local people wherever we go? Well, one of the ways, of course, is you can engage with local construction. But the problem is that, and I had the opportunity to go out to Rwanda and understand local construction and where it works. The problem is that quality is really variable, safety is a real issue, and being able to deliver something on time and to spec was going to be really difficult. And also, the people who benefit actually from the large construction projects over there aren't the people on the ground. They tend to be big construction companies based in the big cities, and they're often Western owned. So you're not putting the benefit in. So if that's really what's driving us, how do we do something different? So we decided to make a componentized system, which we could send 50% of it out in containers, and 50% of it we could source locally. And then we would train and use local people to build the factories, and then flip over and run them. So that was the whole idea of factory in a box. And we tested. We had to test this system to see if it would work. And because being able to build it with local people was a really important part of the value that we were trying to drive, we had to think of a way of demonstrating that piece. So what we did is we got a group of ex-Gurkha soldiers. I don't know if people are aware, in the UK, there's been a long-standing relationship between Nepal and the British Army, and people from Nepal joined the Gurkha regiment. And then after spending time, 10, 20, 25 years in the British Army, they did then go back to Nepal or stay in the UK. And what a company realised was these people are a really good source of resource. So there were companies who had sort of gathered together these ex-Gurkha soldiers. But none of them were in construction. So none of them were construction workers, but they were a group of people who you could sort of trust and rely on. So what we did is we trained them how to build the factory, and then we got them to build the factory. This was only a test, but it was a proper factory, and we got our quality people in to agree it, but they built the factory. And that's the team that did it. And it was a very adaptable system, so it was made of a kit of parts, and you could build a small factory and you could expand it, and it would deal with lots of different product ranges. So there was lots of opportunity. And we've since my time in GSK, although our strategy towards Africa changed because of, and we were talking yesterday about how the winds hit business, but that was at the time that GSK got really bad press in Japan because of some of the things that were done by the sales forces. That completely diverted the company, and Africa strategy got put aside for a number of years. So that didn't happen there, but what we've since done is use Factory in a Box to build very rapidly R&D facilities, and the last one we built with 4 people in 10 weeks, which is amazing if you know anything about pharmaceutical projects. What we'd inadvertently done with all of this is started to create a digital learning organisation, and we didn't really set out to do that, but we suddenly realised that that's what we'd done. So we'd started to build a catalogue of components that could build factories, and we knew how those would go together. We started to build a catalogue of chips which are sort of core to the business and how we manufacture products. And we'd also started to look at the whole portfolio of projects and how they map to strategy and how they map to components. So you start to create a digital environment which allows you to have discussions, much broader discussions about how you turn strategy into projects. And we'd also started to create this repository of knowledge. And financial models, capacity models. We did quite a lot on one of the big issues for pharmaceutical companies with new products is you're very unsure what the yield of those products will be because that's an ongoing development program, and you're also very unsure of what the demand will be in the marketplace. And surprisingly, no one had done this, but we developed some Monte Carlo statistical analysis that allowed people to have those discussions to understand in percentage probability terms how likely a scenario was going to hit the demand, which was a much more mature than people saying, no, I think we should be this big or I think it should be this big. So this digital environment that we'd created, I now call creating my own name. I like creating my own names. No one else likes it. They all fall flat, but I like it. So I started to think about construction as being phygital. So it's truly nowadays, and becoming so, a real combination of physical and digital. And that's right through the life of a project as you go from strategy into operation and back. So right from ideate, right through to running a factory. And what we're finding when we're doing the ideation piece and the conception and the modelling, what we're finding is really where the value is driven in that factory, which then tells you what to measure when you're in operation. So the whole thing is linked digitally. And the sort of physicality becomes a secondary thing, especially if you can build it with component parts. It's like an add-on. The really important thing is to understand how value is driven through that and the digitalisation of that. So phygital. So this is showing you right from beginning to end of a strategy going digital. So this is looking at continuous manufacturing of API. And the issue was it's very slow often to turn things from research and development into production. And what we wanted to do is to create a platform for doing that. So these are sort of chips, but they're unit operations. And the whole idea is that R&D would use these unit operations to do their testing and could pull them in and out and modify them as they wanted. But when they got something that worked, we would then lock down those chips, and they would then become the real system, and we could build them. But also in the learning operation, we could at the end of a product, or if a product failed, we could take some of them out and reuse them. So there was a reuse of physicality as well as the digital. So this was very much to start with a digital strategy. But what we wanted to do then is turn that digital strategy into digital reality. So we worked with the guys who are looking at manufacturing operations and what they were thinking about in terms of guided production in the future. So rather than operators following paper SOPs, how information could be brought to them directly, and them interacting with equipment and machinery, and that requires a digital interface. So what you're going to see in a moment is if you superimpose the chip design at a detailed level on the equipment, it allows you to use things like augmented reality, which allows you to interact with the process in a very different way. And also all those digital systems pass information back into the strategy development process. So it's a learning process. It's a digital learning process as well as a physicality. So this was a particular piece of work which went from beginning to end in that sort of digital process. So my final slide, but one is another made-up word, which I sort of apologise for. It's a process. And because it does have a direction, so of course it has a direction, but it also has to be incredibly fluid. And it has to flow. So I'm process. And this is how I see the strategy working. So to the left-hand side, you start off with this problem or opportunity. And as you understand the problem space, and often, interestingly, that's presented as a solution space, and our job is to listen to it as a solution space and then translate it back into a problem space. But you have the problem or opportunity space, and then you're looking at solutions, and then you're looking at manifestation. What I mean by manifestation is how do you think you're going to do it? And I think you've got to do all those three things. And what we found is that once you've worked out how you think you're going to do it and the implications, when you feed that back to people, they say, oh, now that I know that, I've now changed my idea of what this opportunity is. It's now changed. Particularly speed and time to market can really change the strategy for delivering a product into the marketplace. So when you've said, well, these are the possible solutions, we could do this, and this is how quick we could do this, and this is how quick we could do this, they go, oh, well, now I know that, my opportunity's changed. I've got a different opportunity. So in that digital environment, what you're doing is circling as quickly as you can. You're going back. And when I talk about collaboration, I don't know whether I made this clear. I don't just mean collaboration within the team. I mean, we got our president of manufacture to come in and talk to us. We got our head of finance to come in and talk to us and work with us and understand what we were doing. It's a collaboration right across. We talk directly to commercial people and understand them. It's not just a collaboration of the team. It's getting everyone involved to try and understand. Because whenever you ask someone what's the problem or opportunity, they'll give you an answer, but it won't be the right one. It'll just be their current view of what that is. And it takes a lot of effort and engagement to get people to a place where they really understand the space themselves, the problem space and the solution space. But it's really exciting and interesting doing that, but it's very digital. So if you imagine the left-hand side really spinning around quite quickly, now and again, what you suddenly do is decide to do something. Yeah, so, oh, now we could put this factory here, or we could change this sales team over here, or whatever it is, you decide to do something and you flip it. You flip it over into the configure it, design it, you assemble it or build it or implement it, and then you prove it and operate it and learn, and then you feed that information back. But all the time, the left-hand side is whirring. So it's whirring and you're flipping things out. into the actual physification. And that's where the phygital comes in, because the right-hand side is this combination of something physical. And that can be a building, but it can also be a new organisation or a new way of working or whatever, but it's something tangible that you can deal with. And then having learnt from that, you find a way of digitally feeding that information back, so that becomes the basis of your continuing strategy development. So it's a very dynamic process. And that's all I've got to say. Thank you very much indeed.
Terrific. Be still my MIT SDM heart. There was a lot in that those of us in SDM are very happy about. I have one quick question, and we'll open up for others as well. You emphasized in the system the importance, and when I system I mean the approach, the importance of transparency and also visualization. Let me ask, in this phygital transformation, and I do like the phrase. I mean, if an Englishman can tell me to make up new things in the language, I guess it gives us Americans permission to ruin the language further. But there's an importance of tangibility, which we have a common friend who thinks about these problems. And I recall from working in Japan in the 1980s and talking in the car factory about the criticality of the Kanban being physical, a card. And of course, as an MIT person, I asked, well, can't we just, I mean, you have a system for this, you have a database, you have, and they said, no, it has to be tangible. Yeah. It has to be an artifact. So as we move to further digitalization, what is the significance of tangibility as a quality, and how might we ensure that we retain that? And how do you think that relates to the cognitive processes at hand?
So the first thing that occurs to me is what we found is, particularly with, if you start using virtual reality, that does have a tangibility to it. So people, if you build a facility, like I was saying, and put people in goggles, they feel like they're in the facility. So it does have its own tangibility. It's not the same as physicality exactly, but it certainly draws people in. And one of the programs I'm working on at the moment is a prison building program, and they're changing the way they're going to operate prisons. And they brought the prison officers in, and I saw them. I was in a meeting next door, actually. I wasn't in this meeting. But next door, they had 3 prison officers walking around with virtual reality goggles on, walking up and down prison floors and looking to see whether they could see prisoners inside them when they opened the doors, and they were carrying out their roles. So there's something about that. But I think physicality is important, and we have used 3D printing as well to do that. So we did something with the manufacturing technology centres in the UK, and we wanted to show them what that sort of componentized construction was like. So what we did is we 3D printed a construction kit, and we got them to construct things. So I think you've got to think through these, but there is an issue, but I think virtual reality is an important tool in that arena.
Any questions? Yes, Tom.
Bit of an engineering-y question, but in your chip approach, how did you handle interfaces? Because if you're going to generate a strategy that's based on one block or one chip interacting with the other one, someone's got to manage or engineer or design the interfaces.
Yeah.
How did you do that?
I think it's about defining, understanding interfaces. I say the chips have, when I talked about chip intelligence, to some degree that's about their understanding of interface. So they, within the chip, the engineering design has an understanding about the level of interface. And what we do is understand the difficulty or criticality of that interface. So some of them are very straightforward, so you don't, they will be sorted out later on. Some of them we realise are going to be quite difficult interfaces, and therefore we do some upfront design work and thinking about their interface, and that's part of their engineering data, if you like.
Do you end up with you had said you had ended up with a set of guesses that mattered and a set of guesses that didn't matter. Did you end up with a set of interfaces that mattered and a set of interfaces that didn't matter?
There's a huge amount in here about sensitivity all the time. When you're working in that front end, you've got to understand what's really important to sort out and what actually is okay to leave. And that's a really important part of the process, because otherwise you're presenting options to the business which in a way are dishonest, because they can't really, you don't know if they can be done. So all the time you're thinking about, and that transparency in trying to codify what you know and what you don't know and how important that is really important part of this process. And in the past, actually, I know that things have been presented to the business which were dishonest in large effect because they weren't deliverable. And that's not my job. My job is to give the business options that are deliverable, at least to the best of our knowledge, our collaborative knowledge. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, I saw another a hand up. We'll go to Patrick here, please.
John, love that. Have you also applied it in an R&D context in pharma, or was it just in production?
So we haven't done it in R&D chip thinking, but what we have done is taken it outside of classical projects. So it's been applied, for instance, to airports and the flow of people going through airports. And of course, they go through different functions of check-in and the shopping area, which is really important to airports and their money, and then immigration and security, and all those have a chip approach to them. So it's not necessarily just a physical thing. It's about understanding that step in the process and what's important to it. So that sort of modular thinking about problems is something you can apply more generally.
But, you've worked in pharma.
Yeah.
So could it be?
Absolutely, yeah. Because everything goes through a set of steps which are value adding, and it's about understanding them, understanding what's the value driven by that, and what are the costs and difficulties in doing it, and how do we do that, and then how does that piece interact and fit with every other piece to create a system model. And that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to model at that level and the large all the time. Yeah.
It's Vic.
I was dreading this question. I said I was dreading this question. No, it's fine.
It's a friendly question.
Good.
I'm a friendly guy. No, I wanted to say how much I enjoyed your presentation. It was very good. And I want to follow up really on Brian's point about artifact. I think we make a huge mistake when we think of artifacts only as physical. There are intellectual artifacts. And it's the ability to conceive, create, and conceptualize intellectual artifacts, I think, are equally important as being able to design physical artifacts. And in fact, I'll say that the most important intellectual artifact in strategy and the implementation gap is the inability that we have, including myself in particular, which is why I'm expressing this point, is the ability to integrate an intellectual artifact and a physical artifact into a single concept that is actionable and operational. So kudos to you for bringing this up.
The other thing I was saying, just thinking about, is I'm also very struck by how people like pictures of buildings and nicely designed buildings, and they're actually really important. One of the best things to do if you want to impress your CEO is to put a future-looking building design in front of him, and that really means something. So there are, I take the point, there are very different levels of artifacts and what people engage with. Yeah.
Eric, and I'm prerogative, and Vic, with the exception that the value of an artifact is that it pushes back. It represents its own physics. So we have intellectual artifacts. We have to understand, do they have that quality of pushing back on us despite what we think? So we'll hold that for later. That was Eric.
So, could you comment a little bit about the investment in creating the chip library? Usually in creating these kinds of libraries, you have to invest resources, time upfront, and then you have to maintain the library and so forth. And who was the sponsor for this kind of investment, and how is this seen coming?
Okay. So when we came up with this idea, I went. Actually, it was Emma Walmsley, who wasn't CEO at the time, but she was head of the consumer healthcare, and she ran the capital board. And I went to her with this proposal. And all I asked for to start with was a bank account with £1 million overdraft in it. My view was always that we should be able to run this cost neutral with normal design that we would do anyway. But I was aware that we might have to do some upfront work. How it turned out is I never had to use my overdraft. We made a conscious decision for two reasons. One of them is that we wouldn't develop a chip unless it was part of what we were doing now. It was part of developing strategy and plans. There's two reasons for that. One of them is cost, but the other reason is that people aren't committed to it. If you're just developing something because you might use it, there's a very different feeling about that. So actually we found that only when you needed it did people really engage. So it was a good strategy that way. So we just developed chips as we went along. So as a project came in and we developed them and then we put them in the warehouse. You also asked about the ownership. So I very much believe that the ownership of the chip should be with that business because it's their value creation. So we had this conversation about them owning them. We would have subject matter experts sign them off that they were to the level of design that was appropriate. And that's another thing you have to be really transparent about. Because some of the chips, when you're doing early modeling, is just literally a colored box with some capacity modeling in it. You know, when you get to delivering a factory, it's actually a really complex 3D design with lots of data, but so they're at different levels. So you have to be really transparent about where each chip is. And maintenance isn't an issue because what tends to happen is it's not completely standardized. So what happens is someone takes a chip and then they review it for its application and it gets modified and updated appropriately. So it's not meant to be absolute acute standardization. And so chips get moved. And what we then do is just go through a process of saying, is this new developed chip better than the old one, or is it too project specific? And if it's better, we put it back and that becomes the core chip. Yeah. So that in itself is a moving environment.
Well, unfortunately, we have to move on, but I want to thank John again on behalf of everyone. Wonderful.
Thank you.
But hold those questions for the break. So we have a section of first papers this morning, starting with George. If you can join us, George Roth, including a discussion at the end of this block. And so in 1 hour, we'll have our next break. Vic, if you could check with your slides for later this morning with the booth. They're looking for your slides from today. Good.
Thank you, Brian. I brought my phone here with me, not because I'm expecting to get a call, but I wanted to just point out we were talking about the importance of tangibility in the strategy process. And one of the posters that I noticed yesterday and talked with the student at was called, this was an SDM student here, Pioneering Genomics Innovation, Using Dynamic Work Design to Implement a System of Organizational Boundary Objects. Ben's his first name, I don't remember his last name. I think he's working with Professor Repenning at studying the lab process in the Broad Institute. And one of the things that captures your attention in his work is a project board that they have set up in one of the conference rooms. And he was telling me that that's kind of how they plan their improvements and their innovations, and he instrumented all of that. But what was critically important was when people would gather around that board, talk about how things were going, put up stickies, take off stickies, celebrate that process there. And I think that going back to the comment that we heard it earlier, the tangibility of being able to do that, to gather around something, that we call that a boundary object, to be able to contribute to it, take away from it, really make it yours, and represent what the whole community is doing in such a way that each of the different elements see themselves represented there is really important. So a plug for that, and a reminder that I think as much as we like the virtual things that we do, it's really hard for users to change it. They can experience it, which is a part of that, but the ability to own it and change it is very different. So my presentation, oh good, it's up there. I don't think this was part of the conference plan, but unfortunately I think John did my presentation. So my presentation is about distinctive capabilities. As an academic, we watch what people do, we come up with labels, we put labels on them, and then tell you that's what you should do too. Well, what I saw, what John just talked about, was a distinctive capability that Bristol Myers Squibb developed. GSA, I had the wrong company? GSA. Okay, GSA, thank you. I'm glad I have a coach in the front row here. To build these factories to deliver products. So they have the strategy of, we want to bring a product to market, you know, we're going to take this kind of market share, we're going to have this kind of investment, but how do you do that? You need a capability underneath of that. And that's what my talk is about here. I'm going to also start it out by connecting back to what Brian had challenged us with at the end of the day yesterday, which was this, as a scientist visiting an organization, how would we know that strategy is felt? And in the notion of what Hal said, I don't think it's a question that I want to even try to answer, because that means I'm going to go on my existing knowledge, but it's going to be a question that I'm going to come back to at the end of this presentation and see whether you would agree with that, and see what answers you may have for that as well. What are the strategy challenges is my outline. I'm going to talk specifically about the idea of capabilities and organizations who build capabilities. I am an organizational sociologist, so I tend to ground what I do in things that I've done and experiences that I've had. I had the advantage also of spending a decade in management, some of it which included doing some strategy work, so that helps me in this area here. And then I connect it to the concepts that we have, and I try to package it in a way that makes it useful to go forward for both business and both for our understanding of business through research. So the simple message is here, let's look at what are distinctive capabilities and why would we care about them. So part of the question is, how did I come to my own realization of why distinctive capabilities were important? And that realization came from an opportunity to work on a research project with Strategy and Business and what was originally Booz & Company around studying who does strategy really well. And this was a bit of a unique thing for a consulting company to do. It had to do with a relationship that I've had for many years with a guy there that is the chief editor of Strategy and Business, Art Kleiner, and work that we did in studying learning organizations, which was basically how do we study learning processes in such a way that we also enhance and develop them. So he asked me to come and help them set up a study for looking at strategy. We interviewed about 45 managers, and it led to the book that was published by Harvard Business Press in 2016 called Strategy That Works, which I understand has done and been successful as a strategy book. I'm not going to review what we came up with there for our insights, because I actually wanted to go back and look at the question a little bit more fundamentally. What drove us, and what can we learn from what drove us? But essentially, the book comes up with 5 unconventional acts, which, when companies do that, they're much better at strategy and its execution. We did not focus on the strategy implementation gap, so this is a bit of a complement to that. But there tended to be less of a gap because strategy was done with a view on how it would be executed. So like any research process, we figured how we would engage companies and have a process of interviewing them and then assessing what people said to figure out what we could learn across the 14 companies that we featured in that book. And this probably goes back a little bit to the notion of how do you get people to tell you what's important rather than just answer your questions. So one of the ways in which we approached this activity was in creating a couple of artifacts that would help people remember what they did over time so that they could then tell us what was most important about their strategy and their work to execute it. So one of those artifacts is really a pretty simple thing called a timeline. I am going to use one of the companies, partly because I was one of the people involved in interviewing them, and partly because they also are an SDM sponsor, Danaher Corporation. We looked at a timeline of what Danaher had accomplished over the past 25 years, and we looked at who the leadership were, the business events and processes, the approach to business, and some of the results that they had achieved, and we put milestones on there. We did that from work that we could find through the trade press, and this was an artifact that was continually developed through the interview. So when we went in to talk to executives or VPs or senior people, we kind of presented that timeline, and they usually validated that. They said, oh, you missed this. This was really important. You know, here's what I did, and here's what I was involved in. So we got them to really tell us a story like John just did about what they did to make their organization successful, to achieve some of the results that has us interested in them. So those were pieces of that. The other thing that we did is we looked for companies that had a particular orientation of strategy, which is building capabilities. And in the process of doing the interviews, we also came up with what we called a set of distinctive capabilities. And I can't quite read those, but I will share them with you for Danaher Corporation. They have to do with mergers and acquisitions, an original part of what the company did in terms of buying businesses and real estate, holding on to it and then selling it at a later time, or finding actually they could improve it well enough. They're well known for the Danaher Business System, which is a distinctive capability, meaning that they are about the business of running a business and have invested and use many good process, lean, quality management techniques. They have a strong focus on leadership development, both for their own leaders and for the companies that they have acquired, and a process to decide whether they'll become part of the Danaher system. They have a process for actually deciding where they're going to play. So the platform strategy and organizing and bringing together business units. And I think there's a process-focused approach is what we saw as their distinctive capabilities. So the notion of capabilities played a strong role both in the interview and also in the write-up. And what is a capability? I think we saw John talk about that really well. It's about a set of processes that the organization develops based on knowledge, skills, and behaviors that it encourages, that's supported by tools and systems to deliver that, and has people and organization as part of it. And I would add to that also the notion that we have to also have assets and resources behind it. And that was, I think, the question that Eric asked John is, you know, how'd you get the funding to do this? So the company has to make the decision to have and hold the resources to do that. Distinctive capabilities are the 3 to 5 things that organizations focus on and do really well. So that makes what they do distinguishing and differentiating. in terms of bringing together those combinations of capabilities, and they are at a large scale. They do things like enable successful products, maintaining growth, holding customers' loyalty, developing talents, transcending market limitations, and distinguish the company in what they do. They're hard to recreate because, as we heard what John said, his process was not an easy one. It took him time to get people on board, to get the organizational line with it, therefore, they do require a focus. I'm sure there were other things that your company did that contended for its resources, including time of executives. Perhaps one of the most important things is having executives recognize this is the thing that we do that's world class, that we invest in, and that we protect and hold. And oftentimes, by the way, people outside don't see it. They see the performance of the company, and they don't know exactly why. But anyone that would be knowledgeable would see that these are how these distinctive capabilities work, and then they're brought to scale. Again, just a great presentation, a genius to put me after John, because we have the illustration, and we do that at a larger level. So the paper, which is written with Alex Rao, I forgot to say and mention Alex's name, looks at the history of capabilities, capabilities in strategy, and its importance, and going from just a capability and organizational capability to a distinctive capability view. The final piece that we also looked at in strategy that works, and this is actually directly from the book. For each of the 14 companies we studied, we did what we called an identity profile, which provided a little bit of history on the company, its value proposition, because that value proposition is enabled by the capability system, which are the set of things that they do extremely well to deliver the portfolio of products and services. So in many ways, this is consultant speak, meaning like this is what you should do. And I want to make this a little bit more into research experiment speak. And the question that I have here is, you may have remembered that diagram about the strategy formulation and strategy implementation. What if we made distinctive capabilities a target? What if we think about how do we cross these strategy to implementation gap? Part of the question that I have is really a pretty simple one, that we have the people that formulate strategy, they develop their view of the vision of the company, the markets, they do the analysis, they set those targets there. You see them come up with a strategic plan, and that's got the vision, objectives, goals. And then we've got the strategy implementation units on the other end. They're the operators, the program leaders across functional teams. They then are given those targets, and their challenge is to hit them. The focus in most strategy, and I know we've got some presentations on how to do a better job in talking about goals and objectives that came up yesterday as well. The challenge is, what if we had the team that was thinking about strategy, think about its strategy more in terms of its capability system and its capabilities. And that is what goes back to those that implement. And again, the capabilities are the distinguishing and differentiating combination of knowledge, process, and relationships supported by assets and resources that are developed and maintained to reliably produce the products and services that achieve desired results. So my view is what we are creating here is we're creating a quasi-organizational concept, and I would say that it has the opportunity to transform how we think about organization strategy and strategy implementation in the ways that traditional functional organizations were transformed by the notion of cross-functional teams and sets of cross-functional teams, or the fact of how we thought of organizations and managing them from hierarchies and functions and departments to value streams. Because what we have in the notion there of going from a plan guided by strategy to a plan guided by distinctive capabilities is an integration of all the elements that you actually really need to operate. So the focus of strategy, I would propose, should be this idea of have organizations really think about what are my distinctive capabilities, where am I going to play, where are the unique assets that I control, what is the knowledge that I need to be world class, what are the 3 to 6 things that I do, how do I integrate them together to achieve those goals, objectives, and ends, but to move more in that way. So my approach to research is I've been able to describe distinctive capabilities, give you an understanding. I'm in the process of developing a theory, and the next step really is to test that by working with some companies as well as putting forth the idea that we actually enable crossing and navigating the strategy to implementation territory with distinctive capabilities. How am I doing on time? The clock doesn't work. I'm out of time. Okay, so I was going to ask you a quiz whether you cared about it or not. In the end, I'm going to not talk about how capabilities are built, which is an important thing. We have an example of how we go to scale on them, why they matter, give you a flywheel. But I do want to say the bottom thing there, and this is an alternative to embracing agility. I saw that come up on the website the other day of another company. Instead of embracing agility, I suggest we embrace capabilities. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Byron Wilson. I'm the principal and head of Empty Set LLC. I'm here because I was made aware of this moment, and I'm happy to be here by Joseph Naaman and Pella Williamson of DTU. So if you find my presentation problematic, I'm sure it's my fault. It's no fault of these gentlemen at all. But I want to talk a little bit about the use of narrative to better understand strategy and implementation and how you kind of bridge that chasm. A little bit about myself, other than the fact that I have a small consultancy, I consider myself a designer, a teacher, and a healthcare problem solver. I've only ever worked in healthcare my entire life. That's kind of focused energy for where I am. I'm a designer such that I have a master's in science, product design, from Art Center College of Design with dual study at Caltech in bioengineering and biomaterials specifically. I also teach there in the graduate industrial design department. And my company, we only work with healthcare companies because that's what I do. So, narrative. It's a big word. Kind of want to break it down really quickly. I'm actually going to slide between 3 words, and I want to get kind of clear on the terminology and how I'm going to use it. Narrative, story, and plot. I think they're really useful in trying to understand what is the strategy and how do we implement it. We want to put those 2 together. The resolution's not great, but this is a young lady. She looks like she's in front of a bonfire, and her hand is a bit up to her head like this, so she's somewhat affected. There's a story there. You can kind of make that up, and I propose that as human beings, we always try to find the story in things, story in events, to understand them better so we can share that with others and make sense of what we're looking at. I'll add another picture from the same set. Now we see a group of people hovered around a bonfire. Now, the narrative is that these 2 things are connected by some means. The story I propose is actually the chronological order in which they occur. Is she walking towards the bonfire, or are they waiting for her? That's interchangeable. The plot is why she's doing that. So I'm going to kind of slide through these things so that we can understand what is strategy and what is implementation based on the concept of how we are writing an adequate story to create a narrative and what plot we're going to use to kind of drive that across. So an interesting notion is, what if I switch them? So I think there's a relationship here. I could probably say that maybe she's affected because the gentleman standing to the picture that's now on your right hand, maybe he was not being faithful to her. She got a phone call from the female who he was also involved in. Now she's affected. She's late to the bonfire. She doesn't quite know how she's going to handle this. But now I've created a story out of that, and there's a plot that's driving her to the bonfire, to those people. Even though they're having fun, she seems affected, and I can start to create some story around that. So that's an abstract concept, but I wanted to kind of set the groundwork for how I see and how I work through strategy and implementation. So this is a little bit of a tool. It's a little bit convoluted, so let me walk you through it. This is a story wheel, so to speak. Starts with an initial incident. There's a 3-act progression of how I see one can write a successful strategy so that there is an implementation opportunity that reduces the amount of friction that's going to be there. It's going to be hard. To implement any new strategy, you're going to have tough times. What you want to do is minimize those. So we start with an initial incident, and if you can agree upon a resolution, what becomes really interesting is you can make finite the way in which you get to that resolution. And if you do it through iteration, much like John represented in his presentation, I think you can use narrative, you can use story, you can use plot to drive the actions and the actual events. So let's break this down a little bit further. Within most organizations, I think there's 3 archetypes or roles that are kind of played out at any given moment. There's kind of the leader, the manager, and maybe the entrepreneur. So if you can go with me there, that's where I'm going to kind of put the basis of things. The entire wheel that you saw earlier is more about establishing narrative. How do different events, different sequences, and different processes, how do they connect? I think that's a leadership opportunity for which he can craft what's going to be the future of the organization and where are we going. If there's a declarative strategy, how do we get there? I think that wheel gives him the opportunity to validate, is there a good reason for doing this? Is the narrative coherent? And is it probable? If that's the case, then there's probably a likelihood that it'll be accepted and you can go on to success. That's ideally what everyone wants. Now, the manager's job, I think, is the organizer of kind of the flow of people and things. Usually a little risk averse, but they really keep things on track. The way that that wheel can be a benefit to them is that those different segments are different elements of any plot or story structure. And understanding where those frictions might arise, a good manager has an opportunity to deliver really high quality information about the status of things and the iteration of things to the leader, and they can create some collaboration that moves things forward in a really ideal way. The empty blocks is just representing the management of the actual things, like what's taking place. And I think that's for kind of the entrepreneurial role. It's the creator of new worlds. Those structured efforts get really messy, they're really risky, and that's kind of the goal of the manager. So if you kind of sandwich those together is where you get the tool. So if I've said enough to now explain how I'm thinking, let me tell you a story, and we'll use this tool. It became clear to a large medical provider that I once worked for that it needs more than a 15-minute in-person appointment as its primary product for patient and user satisfaction. So the challenge is, the declarative strategy is, how might a large medical provider expand its current product offering for a more appropriate amount of expertise at the appropriate time and the most appropriate way? So the faster, better, easy concept. In this case, I operated as senior manager and oftentimes as entrepreneur as well, with a variety of teams, human-centered designers, design teams, technical teams, operational teams, and reporting to the C-suite, who is in charge of all of innovation. That's the initial incident. So let's travel around my wheel, if you don't mind. So the first is the minor climax of how we're getting over the hurdle of, are we even going to commit to this? Is this the thing that we want to go towards? How might we use technology to treat minor primary care issues remotely? Everyone's walking around with a really powerful computer in their pocket. Surely we need to make use of that to connect people with their physician in a really timely way. So essentially, we're going from telephony to video. The big takeaway from that is there's an organizational-wide effort that's going to be really high risk and uncertain. It's a medical provider. Now, they're really wonderful at what they do, but not a technology company. Makes use of technology, buys technology, partners with technology, but we're going into some uncharted territory. So here's where the manager or myself needs to kind of set the story or create the plot. What's going to drive the sequence of events so that we can find success, develop a strategy, and then implement it. We knew that we wanted to use human-centered design because we got to satisfy people with a strategy that kind of makes it seamless or easy to accept, something that's going to be new and different to the way a large medical provider is going to operate. So that came down to me, knock on wood, maybe I was smart enough, but thinking that I think we're going to be working in the realm of user experience design. So when somebody looks at that phone, that's going to be a really big moment for them. That's going to be new. They've been looking at their phone for medical information, but now they're going to use it for connection. Got to get that right. I think I'd rather concentrate on that than trying to do anything that's going to be whiz-bang on the back end of that. So I don't think we want to create any new technology. The R&D ratio is going to be low here. What we want is incremental technical information. So we already have some systems in place for that software and that distribution channel. We just want to augment how we use it, amplify it. So when I say I set that plot together, that to me is a rags to riches story. And when I say rags to riches story, that's a plot structure similar to Aladdin or Cinderella. This is the protagonist. If we can use the organization as protagonists, they're almost in a wretched state. They're not their full selves. They're not performing as they know that they feel they are in their optimal state. There's a transformation that occurs. There's struggle, there's change, there's plot, there's twist, but that's something that's really communicated easily and well. I use that bottom line structure to communicate how we're going to get through a really tough time. So it turns out, with the research, we found out that minor primary care issues remotely, making use of the phone, actually isn't a good idea. That's going to be hairy. What you're seeing in the visualization is that's not going to be a rags to riches story. It's going to be a quest more than anything else. By quest, I would mean like, think Lord of the Rings. We're going to go off into the wilderness. A lot of things are going to happen, and we're going to come back home maybe. Or it could be overcoming the monster. There's a big hairy beast in front of us, and we have to find a way to thwart or overcome that challenge. Wanted to focus on rags to riches. So the break in the line at the bottom you'll see is that's a moment of risk and uncertainty that as a manager that I talk to my leadership about and say, hey, what do you want to do here? I can do a quest, I can overcome the monster, or we can transform in a rags to riches way. His response is stick to the script, keep with the story. That communication allowed us to refocus, and now we create a new specialty care experience with technology that sorts and processes medical requests. We're not going to go to primary care. When somebody needs help because they're physically ill, and the specialist is where is going to have the remedy, we're going to go around primary care making use of technology. So that's going to be the way we deliver faster, better, easy. So from that point on, I did the research, created a user experience, mocked it up, went out into the clinical environment, got some feedback from folks to say, hey, what happens if maybe you break a bone? Can we get you to the orthopedist quicker? Normally you have to go through the primary care physician. It's going to take 2, maybe 15, 16 days before we actually get you in front of the person who has your solution. We're going to try to use technology and get you there in 2 to 3 days. What we're going to do is we're going to go from telephony to video. By mocking that up, did a really good job of understanding what that capability need to look like. Also found out that creating it's going to be really tough. Once again, there's a crisis. No break in the line, so that's my decision. Do we stick with orthopedics or do we go somewhere else? I decided we go somewhere else. This time we go to dermatology. What we found was that there's a legacy function in the electronic medical record system by which we could almost hijack the transfer of images. So rather than going from telephony to video, we're going to go from telephony to images. So a dermatologist usually doesn't need to lay hands or do anything physically with you. If you give them some really good images, some photographs, and some symptomology, they can make a really smart decision. That's how we can deliver faster, better, cheaper in this context, with the story still being a little bit of a rags to riches plot. So we had the design requirements from the user experience from the previous mock-up, so we already know kind of what it needs to look like, and we know how to create the satisfaction. Now we kind of have our access on the back end. I just needed to ask leadership, do you want to go forth and implement this? So now we're building that. That's kind of the cumulative climax. This is the lead-up moment. We built the structure, we roll it out regionally, and the kind of call sign is Instagram for your skin. If I can get you to take 2 pictures and answer 5 questions, I can get you a solution to your dermatology issue in 14 to 16 hours. You can even go directly to the pharmacy. So that became the innovation that we were able to produce. It really boosts the AQI score, the patient user satisfaction. We technically validated it throughout an entire region of Southern California. It's about 3.5, 4 million people. We designed that pilot, we executed it, and the last thing that we had to do was kind of get over the gap of, how do you tell the medical provider that's elsewhere, other states, other regions, how to do that? Keeping with that motif of kind of narrative, story, and plot, it was actually easy. When we went out to kind of espouse and say, hey, we're ready to scale this new opportunity, the communication barrier was really low. I could talk to them almost like it was a movie. It opened things up. I had the kit of parts ready to go. We had proven, validated, and the implementation road was a little bit smoother and a little bit easier. So we had some assistance in overcoming the gap by, quote unquote, sticking to the script and not letting things kind of spiral out of control, letting plot motivate how we iterate through a really tough problem. Now, I told you several times throughout the process that there was conference between me as senior manager and the C-level as well. He was hearing all of these things about, hey, how much risk do you want to take right now? And it turned out that he was creating other wheels simultaneously while I was working through dermatology. So he was solving the problem through the level of narrative while I was letting plot drive my project. So he as leader, that's his goal. He needs to steer things in the most efficient and the most effective way. So while I was doing what I was doing, he had other wheels going. The difficulty we saw in primary care, he figured that out. He associated with another company that had that sorted. That was now a smart buy for us as a company to buy into that operator. We had requirements on what it needed to look like and how it should integrate into the system. Furthermore, there was a larger overarching strategy moving forward. We know that we don't want to offshore our distinctive capability on another company. How do we start building the ability to do it for ourselves in short time? When that got done, dermatology was tested, it started to implement and proliferate. I moved on and helped to write the strategy for what does a video interaction look like for this large medical provider. The way the story ends, they're still working through it, but they're doing really good. It's tough, but that's what happens in implementation. It's my story. Thank you for listening.
Yeah, so hello everyone. My name is Wanaka from the University of Tokyo. So I will talk about the development of instrument in collaborative modeling environment in group decision making. So this is the agenda of today's presentation. So firstly, I will introduce about the background and research objective. So the main focus of this study, of course, the gap between strategy and implementation. I pick up the definition of these from the Oxford Dictionary, but I know there are various kinds of definition in the different domain. But on the basis of various kinds of definition, the practice that most companies struggle to bridge the gap. So Bright Line Initiative reports that 59% of survey respondents admit that they often fail to fill the gap. Like I define, this is mainly caused by the three reasons: poor unrealistic strategy, poor incompetent implementation, and some communication problems between the two. The second one is more related to the project management, I mean the implementation side, but the first one and third reason is more about strategy making. So I will focus on the first reason and third reason of the reasons. So previous research shows the various kinds of contribution of the model-based strategy making by groups. Like they provide a clear evidence, they provide a mental model alignment, they provide a good consensus, more commitment to decisions. So it means like a model-based approach to make a strategy, especially co-creation of the model by group, has a bunch of contribution which can be the gap, can be the bridge to fill the gap. I mean that these contribution can solve the problems about the poor unrealistic strategy or more communication problems between the two. But however, previously also reports that such a group working has several risks. For example, the group sync, group escalation, group polarization, something like that. It's caused by that group phenomena of the human behavior. So the balance in the group walking is important. So we need group not dominated by a few people to reduce the risk in group decision making, whereas the contribution in group is one solution to do that. This thinking is demonstrated by the many kinds of psychological study. So for example, we showed that groups of few people dominate have less collective intelligence. Some psychological study shows that those risks frequently happen when there are people who dominate the groups of pressure, preventing the free communication. So the objective of this study is that to develop a collaborative modeling environment which makes groups, members' contribution balanced in the system's modeling process. And in a case study, the developed environment is applied to the actual case workshop by students of Team University of Tokyo to build a stakeholder body network. Stakeholder body network is kind of one model to represent the relationship between the stakeholders and values, and which it can be utilized at the early stage of the strategy making to clarify stakeholders' needs and expectations. So the method, how we detect the unbalanced contribution in such a modeling process. We propose new ideas about contribution mapping on the model diagram. I will show the example later on, but this is the visualization of each member's contribution degree on the model diagram. How we measure the contribution on the model. The measurement is based on the two kinds of data. One is the conversation log in the process, and the second one is the modeling log in the process. So when we obtain these two kinds of data, we can associate these two data like this. Oh, how should I say? And so the colors represents the speakers, and the others represents the actions. So on the basis of the assumption, all conversation before actions is related to the action, we can calculate how much conversation was made for the action. And we define this is a contribution for the model building. So this is the example of the contribution mapping of the model. So left diagram shows the final derivative of modeling, and the right one shows that one people's contribution mapping on the basis of the method. So to realize this measurement, we propose the environment monitor the audio data and log data of modeling process, which is by software and some sensors. So software provides the function to function for the people to draw the model diagram, and behind the function, the system always monitors the human's behavior. At the same time, the sensors like a microphone or the camera also capture the human's face or voice and remotely send to the server. At the server side, the post-process is run and make a contribution mapping and the feedback, return the feedback to the group. This is our proposal. So on the basis of a proposal, we developed both of hardware and software as a prototype. So this slide shows the hardware part of environment, the table for the workshop. So table has USB camera and microphone for each members, each participants, and also the microcomputers is installed for each sensor. So the microcomputer collects the data and send it to the server automatically by a wireless network. So this table, and at the center of the table, we put the display, and so the participants can share and draw their diagram by the laptop. So this table by this table, instrumented sensor naturally collects the human's physical data. And also, we developed the software, which is web-based modeling software for now, which provides the function only for the stakeholder body network. The point is that behind this user interface, the system always monitors the model changing, which is caused by the modeling process, and accumulate the data as a log. So automatically send it to the server and associate with the audio data and calculate the contribution at the server. Okay, so for now, I explained the idea and prototype of environment. So I will explain about how to apply it and how the system behave in the actual case. So to verify the function of the prototype, the workshop by the students of University of Tokyo was conducted. The objective of this workshop to write the stakeholder network. Participant is the 4 students of our laboratory, and the topic is about on-demand bus system, which is the bus system like Uber for the elderly people in the rural area. And it takes around 35 minutes. Unfortunately, we couldn't utilize the software to draw the diagram. So the collected data is the microphone, audio data from the microphone, and video data to capture the drawing. But so this case study has 2 objectives. First one is to verify the accuracy of the function to detect speakers from using data from microphones. And the second one is to test the idea contribution mapping and demonstrate the feasibility of ideas. So procedure is like using audio data and video data. Firstly, we compared the result of speaker identification. I mean the result of compare the system result and also result of the humans recognition. And the secondly, we extract modeling log from the video data and build a contribution mapping by test. So this is a result of speaker identification. So a result by system and versus result by human recognition. It is not possible to show all the data, so we just extract that from 12 minutes to 13 minutes, just for 1 minute. But the upper diagram shows the low audio amplitude data, and the diagram at the downside shows that identification result by human and by system. So as you can see, that the results, so identification seems to be good. The tendency is the same, but a little bit sensitive. So it is caused by the noise when the participants writing a diagram or something of voices for responding to the other, like or ooh, something like that. So yeah, a little bit sensitive, but yeah. From this result, we verified the function of identification, speaker identification. And this is the result of workshop itself, stakeholder network final version. And this is the result of contribution mapping. I extracted the 2 people's result. So you can see clearly, this diagram clearly shows the unbalanced contribution of the teams. I'm not surprised. This is, for me, it is not surprising for me because participant 1 is the most senior student of this group, and the participant 3 is the most junior student. So clearly, participant 1 dominates this group, and this is what we want to detect in the modeling process. So we want to return the feedback to participant 3. Are you okay? Does the result make sense for you? Something like that. So this is we want to show the group unbalanced contribution. Yeah. So discussion. So, but through the case study, we found that the 3 difficulties to calculate the precise contribution on the model. The first one is the participants sometimes move to the next topic in writing diagram about previous topic. It's natural because when someone writing the diagram, the others is free, the others are bored, should wait. So the other wants to move on to the next topic, but because it's okay. But because of this phenomenon, our system easily lose the consistency between the actions and the contribution. So we need to install the user interface which can constrain for the participants not to do such an action. And the second one is people sometimes like the diagram just show their idea, not the result of consensus. It is also a problem for our algorithm. So we put the plastic ball on the screen and allow the participants to write this idea by white marker. And this might be helpful for the participants to share their thinking, and also that might be helpful for us to calculate the precise contribution. And so one is the continuous existing of continuous actions. So we assume that one-on-one matching of the conversation and the actions, but in actual case, we can observe that multiple actions on one conversation. So we need to introduce the theoretical logic or threshold to identify the discontinuous action. That's it. So the conclusion. So the key message of this presentation is that the model-based strategy making by group is helpful to fill the gap between strategy and implementation. They will provide the mental model alignment, commitment decision, evidence-based decision, something like that. But still, we should be careful about the human's behavior in a group. So we are developing the collaborative modeling environment, which makes members' contribution balanced, and just show the one application and see the verification of the function and demonstrate that idea. So that's it. So thank you for coming.
Great. If I could have Byron and George come join us at the front. I'm not sure we have any portable microphones. Can I steal one from the?
They're right here.
Oh, they're right in front of me?
Yeah, hang on.
Yeah, they're waving at me from the booth. Terrific. And I'll prompt you from here, I guess, because. But first of all, really wonderful. Thank you. 3 really interesting presentations that follow up on John's presentation, and we've zoomed in on the bridge, and we've talked about something about the capabilities on that bridge, and you each addressed it in a different way. Let me ask you. I'm going to use 2 keywords. One is coherence. What is it about the capabilities on the bridge and the coherence of the actions and interchanges, actions and interactions that is significant to the collective capability on that bridge? The second key word is usefulness. There are many things, we talked, John, and I think, Tom, you too, you were bringing this up. There's many things we can do in a modeling environment, in creativity techniques and methods. There's many things we can do. But how do we understand what is useful in the shaping of the capabilities along the bridge? So let me start with you, George, just opening it up. Can you comment on something about, how do we know if what's happening on the bridge, the capability of this, I'll call it somehow the fluid, even recursive interaction between strategy and implementation is coherent? And how can we tell if it's useful?
So the question was around coherence and usefulness around developing capabilities. The part of the presentation that I skipped over was really the model that we had developed, how capabilities got built. So it generally starts with having some identity, some identification of that, and then a process of trying to bring that to scale. And the real question is, when you bring it to scale, do you produce results? And then part of bringing that to scale then is developing recipes so that you can teach it to others. And from there, you end up being recognized for it. It becomes a virtuous reinforcing cycle, and then you would make attempts to get to a level of mastery, both in terms of persistence, but also in terms of adaptation. So it really is the feedback process that lets you know about coherence and usefulness. I mean, coherence is your ability to produce results, because simple capabilities really don't do that, but distinctive capabilities that allow you to uniquely support your value proposition do allow that.
Let me go to Byron for a second. So Byron, in the same way, you know, I've seen a lot of good movies and bad movies, right? And so again, in the same way, I mean, how do we know if the plot and the narrative is useful and coherent?
The language needs to integrate and be commonly understood and recognizable by everybody involved. And I'll break that down. Probably not a good moment to try something new and have a plot propelled by a tragedy or a tragic plot sequence. And also, you might want to, or you need to always be using the language that is from and amongst the culture to kind of push that level of coherence based on communication quality and the ability to understand one another. What I also try to bring to the conversation is a little bit of validation and proof. So I wasn't able to show in 15 minutes, but for every round of, well, I want this to happen and this is the way that it's going to unfold, I've already done a piece of that. And here's my feedback. I've already prepared a reasonable mock-up of what this product looks like, and I've already put it in front of people in an A/B before-after test, and I videotape their response. They like it. And here's a reasonable way that we can get to creating that. I've thought about that too. I think it looks like this. I'm certain I'm wrong. But between these two elements, that comes to form some good reason, some probability, and I think we can come together and create a good story together. I think the best stories are ones that take into account everyone's needs. So you start making that together.
Well, and that's interesting. That's a bridge to Shinosuke's presentation around contribution and balance. I mean, I think if we turn this on its head, you know, Shinosuke, you and the group there at Tokyo and part of GTL are trying to build sensors for a number of things, including what you showed today. Do you think that, so you showed that we can begin to understand in the moment, in real time during this these interchanges, that we might detect some things. How would you detect coherence? I've had, as you guys can probably guess, I've had many incoherent conversations in my life. How might I judge if we see the senior student and the junior student contributing, relating, interacting? Any thoughts on what it means to judge coherence, Shinosuke?
You mean from sensors, like more from data?
Sensor in the broad sense. I mean, the point is, whether I'm a manager using my judgment or I'm using a data sensor, the point is I'm observing and interpreting, whether or not the interactions on the bridge are coherent.
I don't have any idea to capture these, more deeper coherence by the sensors. I mean, by more data-oriented methods. But how should I say? It's hard to say that.
Well, so PS are you here, PS, somewhere? So we'll talk about PS's thesis after lunch. And she's struggling with this as well. So we're using different sensors to detect what's happening and trying to extract out whether it makes sense. Let me ask one more kind of thread of questions here, which is about recursion. And Vic, I know this is a popular topic, and Richard, we discussed it this morning as well. You remember in Richard Hodges' presentation yesterday, he showed us the many layers of organism that are occurring. The bridge is not actually one bridge, right? It is a series of bridges and often maybe stories of a bridge where the interchange between strategy and implementation are ongoing. So there's many of these conversations, right? How do you reflect? Let me go back to you, George. How does your understanding of distinctive capabilities and their development map to an understanding of the system as recursive?
Map to, what was the last thing you said?
How does it map to our understanding of this system as recursive?
So how does capabilities map to the understanding of the system? For me, the issue is that we think about strategy in terms of visions, goals, and objectives, not necessarily embedded in what we do and how we do it, and that is a fundamental element of distinctive capability. So it includes the organization and people element that are part of that. So we don't separate the idea of strategy as just a target and a goal from what people do, but we recognize that the organization identifies with, selects, and has success with developing a set of distinctive capabilities that are world-class, that deliver the outcomes of strategy. But the focus of that strategy to implementation process is enabled by the recognition of what those distinctive capabilities are, and that being what guides the effort.
I mean,
and the results come from that.
I wonder, I mean, listening to you, I mean, it may be that if we parse this as distinctive capabilities, the activity is recursive, and the flows, what did you call them, John? The what? Are in fact recursive. So.
And I think one of the things, and the reason I brought up cross-functional teams and value stream management, is when organizations identified those as units that were much more appropriate than traditional ways they thought about themselves, they assigned resources. They started measuring them. They put managers in place for that, and that yielded much better returns for how they operated. So in the same way, I think we need to do a better job of measuring, assessing our capabilities, and learning to develop a set of tools to be able to manage them.
Right. Any questions from the audience? We'll take one question before the break. Patrick.
Question for Shinasuke. Did you observe any change in the group? Because they saw the representation of what they had done.
Good question. Yes, so firstly, so I showed the participant 1 and participant 3. Firstly, participant 3 is quite, very quiet, because I think he doesn't have confidence to make a contribution, but that later process, he learned about the behavior from the participant 1 and a little bit try to make a contribution to that, so he wants to pretend to be a participant 1. So this might be learning effect on the group walking. This is another, phenomenon of this group.
Could they see their results? I think they did not see their results. In this experiment, they could not see the feedback from your sensors, exactly. I think. But we have other experiments where we are seeing that effect. So, of course.
It was really interesting, your work. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering, what the model that you were working through, was it able to qualify what the feedback loop was? So participant 1 was highly active. Was it productive? Once again. Participant 1 had the highest percentage of contribution. Yes. Were you able to qualify the contributions?
You mean the quality of the contribution?
The quality.
Tough question. So I know it's tough, so I just focus on the amount of contribution, compensation as their contribution index. Yes, but maybe it is possible to introduce the topic analysis by AI, and such keyword-based analysis might be helpful to understand the quality of the contribution.
Thank you. We're going to wrap up for a break, and that Lorena, are you here somewhere? Lorena is also working one of our projects where we do a simultaneous look at their outcomes with respect to the product trade space, simultaneously to their contributions. And so we're trying to find ways to sort that out. George.
I just was thinking about that. One of the things that may be very interesting to do in terms of mapping contribution is to assess whether people are making statements or asking questions. Because I think you could use intonation to pretty quickly assess that in speech, and therefore determine, who's asking questions, who's providing information. And that may be as relevant as dominance, particularly if you have somebody with more expertise. You would want them to be dominant, but you would also want to see the form of the communication.
Great, thank you all, and we're gonna take a quick break, a coffee break, for 13 minutes, and then we'll ring the bell when it's time to come back. Thank you.